The opinions you hear on Your Mountain from individual hosts or guests do not necessarily represent those of Your Mountain, our sponsors, or other entities we're affiliated with professionally or otherwise. You've waited long enough. Go listen to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms, Nephi Cole, co-host extraordinaire, sitting at his computer in Sheridan, Wyoming. How's it going?
Still here.
Still here.
Yep.
Man, I kind of just want to dive right in.
Let's dive right in. We don't have any small talk because we are recording this literally 30 minutes after we recorded the last episode. So it gave me enough time to get another delicious cold beverage and to pick my son up from his bird watching camp.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad. I kind of want to know more. A bird watching camp.
Yeah, it's offered by. He went and they talk about all different kinds of birds, and they use binoculars, and then they, just follow birds around, and they do that for half of a day.
I thought you had to be over 55 to be into bird watching.
Well, to tell you the truth, it took it took a little bit of convincing to convince him that this was something that he should spend his time doing. And it's mostly because I didn't want him just sitting around the house doing nothing. And he's really enjoyed it, though. He's learned a ton about different birds, and it's more than I want to know, to tell you the truth.
I bet it's quieter than the trumpet that I'm hearing in my house while my daughter learns a new instrument this summer.
Yes. Bird watching out of the home is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, probably right. Let's dive in. I bet this can be a shorter conversation than the one we just had.
It better be.
It better be. That one was long. Assuming if you're listening to this one, then we had you by the edge of your seat, on the edge of your seat. We had you. You're hooked. You want to know more. You learned all about the history of land disposal and retention in the U.S. You learned about how we wound up with our 640 million acre public land estate. You learned about some of the threats, some of the reasons why folks like Senator Lee might have been pushing for disposal of federal lands. You even learned some of the importance about, from a political standpoint, of being careful in your messaging and to not make this a Republican versus Democrat thing, but to make this an American values thing.
Go listen to that last episode if you haven't, because this one is going to sound ridiculous if you don't listen to the last one.
Yeah, that's right. So here we are. We're still sitting July 3rd recording this, because what else do we have to do with our day today, right? I have the day off from work, and so what thing would I more rather do? Should I be outside enjoying the beautiful weather, or sitting here at a computer screen recording this podcast with you? I'd pick you every time, Nephi.
Well, Dave, I'm about to get in a vehicle and drive to go fishing. So
I'm going to do that soon as well.
That's my priority as soon as we're done. So that's a
reason to make this fast.
Yeah, that's the reason to get this done.
All right, let's get it done.
There's fish to be tortured.
So you learned all about that stuff if you listened to the prior podcast. But what we wanted to talk about in this one is, okay, where do we go from here? This is kind of continuing the autopsy after Senator Lee's attempt to sell millions of acres of public lands failed in the reconciliation package. It was pulled at the 11th hour.
And right? I actually do think that we need to back up long enough to say, how did we get here? And just kind of give an overview that we got here because, our country's grown over time, and we have an immense resource of lands. We're a big country, and through a variety of purchases and a variety of conflicts, we have ended up with a huge land mass. And it was the goal of our country initially. The policy of our nation was to try and take that federal estate that was gained and to move it into private hands and to move it in and to do that for a variety of reasons. Some of them initially economic for the country, then economic for the country in a different way. It was to increase westward expansionism. It was to populate the U.S. It was to grow our cities and things like that. And then we shifted. And there came a point of inflection where we shifted the policy of the country, and we decided that some of these lands, those that had, basically we gave everybody a chance to scoop up those agriculturally productive lands. And then we said, look, the lands that are left over, they're more valuable right now as multi-use public lands, as a resource that everybody can access and use. And that was the decision. That's what we did with our public lands. We decided that we developed this paradigm where they were for everybody and for everybody to use, and we developed some environmental laws related to that to try and make sure that everybody played nice with each other in using those lands. And those laws include FLTMA and NEPA. And then we had controversy where people felt like the change in the policy and the change in the paradigm wasn't benefiting some of the people who were on the ground with those lands. And that directly led to the Sagebrush Rebellion, which that is that's the ground that the roots of this most recent controversy grew in. And what we're seeing is just the outcome of that. And now we're at the point where we've had a bipartisan group of individuals come together, of congressionally elected leaders, push back against that sale that was proposed. And there we are. That literally is where we're at right now. And then the question, now that we've gone through like, okay, how did we get here, is how do we keep, where do we go from here? And both you and I in the last podcast said like, okay, well, here's the number one thing we need to do. We need to recognize this is there's bipartisan support for beating the proposal that came. We need to recognize that, recognize the strength that was in that, and figure out how we get that coalition to move forward.
Yeah, I want to break this discussion. I was thinking about this as you were talking, and we were talking about how to do this. I feel like it might make sense to break this piece into two topics. And the first one I think can go pretty quickly. The second one, it's the more to the devil in the details. Here's the first thing I wanted to talk about. So this just happened, right? Like within the last week, this provision dropped from the reconciliation bill. After it was pulled from the House version, now it's been pulled from the Senate version. The reconciliation bill passed with no land sales in it. So the first thing here in my mind is we have to talk about on the what's next. It's the land sale piece. Then let's talk about the solutions to management and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
But it was amazing. Here's my general thought. It was amazing to see so many people from so many different backgrounds come together and rise up and have their voices heard and have politicians hear their voice and pull this language. And I think it's incredibly important at this moment that we don't just say, okay, we did it. Take a victory lap, congratulate everybody, job well done, and then go back into our respective corners and wait until the next time. So, and I know we're going to talk about part of that, but one of the things I think we need to do is we need to continue to have this dialogue about the importance of public lands to people. A mutual friend of ours, I had posted something on my personal Facebook page, and a mutual friend of ours made a comment on this. And I'd actually been thinking about this, but he phrased it in a way that made me think about this even more. All right. How he doesn't live in a public land state. He lives in a state where like 2% of the state is public land. And so he was looking at the pictures I was posting of camping with my family out on public lands and just being able to go find a spot like where there are no people and post up. And for a couple of days, that's my piece of property, right? And he was talking about how how jealous he was of that. And it also raised this interesting question. We talked about the 100th meridian in the last podcast, and west of the 100th meridian, that's where so much of your public lands is, and east of it, it was all sold. Well, east of that 100th meridian, something like 80% of the population of the country lives east of that line. 20% of the country lives in places that can experience public land on a regular basis. And so I have this thought in my head of like, how, as you and I, Nephi, like, we use public lands all the time. We use it for everything. It's sort of integrated into our everyday lives 12 months out of the year. And maybe we would take it for granted a little bit. Even of the 20% that live in the West, I mean, like, I don't even know what the percentage of that 20% is that uses public lands on a regular basis, but I'd guess it's not, it's probably not more than half. Maybe it is. There's some polling data. I can't remember the number. But the point being, most people's experience with public land is on a vacation somewhere. They have to travel very far. They might experience it every now and again. It might be a national park. They might not be hitting up the BLM lands that we hit. Maybe some folks from other states are coming to Western states to hunt. And I've heard gripes from some of those folks that are saying, well, your states are making it so hard to draw and they're pricing us out. Why should we care about public lands anyway? Because we can't even come use them to hunt on because of the way your state agencies are managing opportunity to the wildlife on those lands. Like, I'm rambling a little bit, but it's because I'm thinking over the long term. One of the strategies that we have to be thinking about for maintaining a coalition, maintaining support, bipartisan support, but national broad support for public lands is how do we keep those 80% of the people that live east of the 100th meridian engaged and caring for public lands the way that we do? And how do we make that argument? How do we sell that? I'm interested. We have listeners from all over the country, so I'm interested in what listeners think, what their perspective is on this. But I'm like scratching my head because if you have, for example, what if you have an Eastern senator that starts talking to buddies in the East and says, why are we spending all this money on PILT, on payment in lieu of taxes for these Western states? Like, why should we keep doing that? We're just subsidizing these Western states. Why are we doing that? Maybe we should stop doing that. If you lose that, it makes it the pathway to selling public lands a lot easier if you don't have that PILT money coming in. So I'm trying to think about the next stage of this, how do we maintain support nationally for public lands? And then the second piece of this is like, how do we address some of these underlying concerns on the management of public lands? Does that make sense? Like, those are the kind of the things that are rattling around my head.
That's a lot, Dave.
I know. It was kind of rambly. I understand.
Yeah. So the first part of it, I agree. Like, so how do you build a coalition that recognizes the long-term, viability and keeps it up there? I think some groups, you need to give credit to great sloganeering on groups like Backcountry Hunters and Anglers who have, I have one of their original keep public lands and in public hands hats. And I think that that's necessary. You have that discussion, those points. So you start there. That paying for them is a big deal, and I think that that's where we fall through the cracks. And I think that's where the problem lies. And paying for them isn't the right thing to say, but it's care of the public lands. It's pretty easy to say public. These are our public lands. We all need to, have care about them. And everybody, this is why it's bipartisan. On the East Coast, and we're like, yeah, or nod their head and agree, right? As soon as you say, how do we pay for these things? Well, we need to pay for them. That's where you start to get divergence, because it's much easier to just say, like, well, let's not worry about it until those lands are in your backyard. And when those lands are in your backyard, that's where when your next door neighbor doesn't mow his lawn for long enough, that's when it starts to become your problem. When they turn the backyard into a junk pile, that's when it starts to become your problem. Well, that's not a problem if you live across town. You don't see that every day. And And I think that part of the solution to the public lands issue has to be an acknowledgement. And I think it's a messaging acknowledgement that we, the federal estate, the public landowner, needs to be a better neighbor. And, PILT is part of that. And there's an education campaign that has to go on where when we say, keep public lands in public hands. Oh, and by the way, we need to manage our forests. Those things can't be mutually exclusive. They have to be able to be talked about together. And if you get somebody to support public lands, you also have to be working to get them to support management of public lands. And that means, keeping the timber where it needs to be. That means, providing the resources to manage the roads. And that's a tougher sell, but that has to happen, because when those things don't happen, when your neighbor puts a junkyard in the backyard, that's when, somebody starts talking about public domain and coming in and taking it over. And, well, I could clean up that yard better myself. Or if you gave us the chance, we'd mow the lawn. Well, if we don't want somebody to come up and say like, oh yeah, well, we can do a better job. Well, then we have to do a good job.
But that's the sort of the second piece. But the first piece is, how do you get people that don't spend a lot of time here, that don't ever see that lawn, right? That neighbor's lawn, that don't ever see the public lands or rarely do. And I recognize, I got to be careful, because I recognize there are states in the east and the southeast that they're pretty good chunks of public land, national forest in particular, but not like we have here, right? And so how do you get the rest of the country, the 80% of the country that lives east of the 100th meridian, or whatever that number is, it's something like that. How do you get them to be as invested in this as we are? Because
this is
for example,
this is a big can of worms, Dave.
I know it is, but if we're going to talk about at some point congressional involvement, like how do you get Congress involved? Like, you're not going to pass a bill with just Western states. Like, you can't do that. You don't have the votes. Like, how do you make it so the whole country cares? I've got a couple of ideas. I was just curious if I was just teeing up the conversation, but I mean, I have a couple of ideas, but I'm curious.
What are you thinking?
I'm thinking things like this. 95% of our winter vegetables come from water that originates on public lands. Like, if you go to the store anywhere in the country and into a grocery store in January and buy lettuce, or, buy, I don't know what all the winter vegetables are, but for sure lettuce, you go in and you buy a winter vegetable, it's coming from water that comes from public lands. So there's an immediate tie to public lands, right? 25% of our nation's oil and gas comes off of public lands, which means all of that revenue generated goes into the general treasury and is spread out over things all over the country. Like, people everywhere in the country benefit from the royalties paid on oil and gas developed on public lands. Like, there's economic, certainly economic pieces to it. There's, outdoor recreation is an over $1 trillion a year industry, and a lot of that outdoor recreation occurs on public lands, and the tax revenue generated from that, not just for the local and state economies but at the federal level, is nothing to scoff at. So I think you can point to things like that and to say that it could be in the best interest of the country as a whole to have these public lands. But most people aren't going to spend the time on them like we do. And I'm just, like, are they going to fight for them the way that folks in the West are going to fight for them? Do they care? How do we make them care?
See, I would actually, and maybe, I don't want to take too much time, I might argue with you and just say, like, I think more people recognize the value than we're giving them credit for. And that's because that's why Senator Lee's proposal failed. Because what really happened there is to me, the reason that it failed is this. The reason that it failed was because you have a contingent that, frankly, doesn't necessarily live with these lands around, that doesn't have as much access to public lands. I'd say that contingent was the solid, like, you could just count on that contingent. They all voted one way no matter what. I'd say that the thing that was, I'd say the thing that was interesting is that the group that cohabitates with those public lands in their backyard, that was the group that that's the swing group for sure. It's the Montana delegation. It's the Idaho delegation. They're people that are intimately, acquainted with public lands because they live with them every day. That's the swing delegation. So I don't think you need to convince the guy that lives in New York City that public lands are important. I actually think you need to convince the guy that lives in Montana that preserving public lands and sharing them is also in his best interest.
I'd argue you have to convince both.
Well,
But
I think you're right. I mean, to an extent, but again, I think most Americans, like, I think the education is important, and I think we have to do that. And I think most of the people that, in fact, I think at the education side, here's what's probably interesting. You mentioned where the water comes from and where the oil and gas comes from and all these other things. I'd say that education, I'd say intrinsically those folks probably think of public lands from a conservationist perspective and never consider the multi-use benefits that come from those public lands. And I think understanding that is critical to finding the consensus on those public lands. Is understanding not just that this is a theoretical place with wilderness that I find valuable, but also understanding that there are millions of people whose livelihood depend on these and a bunch of vegetables and everything else. And so I think you're right in that what we need to find is the way, that's how you find the consensus to make changes rather than just the consensus to, believe it's if this makes any sense, to kind of, that's how you find the middle ground, is with that education that you're talking about, because people care about them. The question is, do they care about them as a theoretical thing, that they never visit, or do they understand the working nature of those public lands and in their everyday lives?
yeah,
I think that's what you're saying.
we could talk about it forever. I'll pivot to something else because we'll get to. It's just something I'm thinking about a lot. Like it's running through my head a lot of like a recognition that most people don't get to enjoy the lands we get to enjoy, and how do we to win this year after year after year to continue to have public lands takes everybody.
The theoretical of all that you and I just said, I think, can be boiled down to this: people have to be acquainted with them.
Yeah, for sure.
And acquainted with them in terms of what the value that they have to our country. And part of the acquaintance that they need to have, and this is the easy one, right, is you need to get people out on them. And that's why hunters were such a big aspect in this, right? Because hunters' voices were so large because they are 100% today acquainted with the value of those public lands this fall. It's not a theoretical to them. It's not there's no tertiary, connection to the gas pump. It's today. This is something that affects me if you do this. And I think that's why the hunting voice was so powerful.
It was powerful, really, really powerful. And I hope it keeps going like that. It's a galvanizer. This is a galvanizing issue for the hunting community for sure. And how going forward, how the hunting community stays galvanized around this issue is going to be really important. Because this isn't going to go this isn't going away right now. Like it's just not. There might be an opportunity here to catch your breath a little bit. But remember, Senator Lee still holds the gavel for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And he could very easily take some of the feedback, I'll call it feedback, some of the feedback about this language, this proposal, and he could very easily come back with a new iteration of this bill and go through the normal order of Congress, like introduce a bill, give it a hearing and a markup, try and pass it out of committee. He may very well try and do this. Now, there might not be an appetite for it after what just happened, but there probably wasn't an appetite for him to take 3 different runs at this in the reconciliation process either. And he did it.
I'd be
Right? So,
surprised if he doesn't. For
yeah.
and there are other stuff. There was a lawsuit in Utah. It remains to be seen what happens with that. But I go back to, and this is as we talk about like, well, what's next? There was some partisan hacks already put out on the internet. A comments on Lee's response to this, where President Trump had talked about federal lands being utilized to better the lives of everyday Americans, type of thing. And the partisan take on that is, oh, well, he means sell them. And, that doesn't have to be the case. And I think, to me, that's where we start talking about solutions, is I think that there's common ground in saying, in finding out how to help our neighbor keep the backyard clean. And I think that's where the magic is. That's where the radical center, that's the solution, is saying like, okay, we have this federal resource, we have these public lands, they should remain in public hands. And with that, how do these lands that belong to all of us benefit all Americans? And how do we help them do that better? That's the discussion I think we need to move to. And that's a discussion that's bipartisan, because everybody wants to help everybody agrees.
Yeah, I think we do. I still think it's 2 parts. I think it's, while we're moving in that direction, you still have to be out there actively saying the public lands, public hands thing, right? You can't let your guard down for a minute. You still have certain state legislators, members of different legislatures that might be, in the coming Congress might view what Senator Lee did and like it, and might jump on it, and might introduce resolutions at that level. You could have county commissions introduce resolutions. Like, there's still going to be this push for land sale or transfer that happens, and it's going to take this galvanized community to continue to be engaged and interested and talking actively with their elected officials at all levels of government about the importance of public lands and the importance of not selling them.
So here's
and the second piece of that, which is to diffuse this over the long term. Like, I'm talking about, like, the first piece of this is like the next 18 months through the next election cycle, effectively, right? That keeping the foot on the gas so that you're making, in an election, you're making public lands a nonpartisan issue, that everybody is stepping up and saying not selling public lands as a part of their campaign platform, depending on which party. So you have to keep that momentum going. You can't stop it now. You have to keep that going for the next 18 months. But at the same time, you have to start having those conversations about, how do we diffuse this over the long haul? How do we prevent this from coming back again in some other iteration? And that's where, like, we have to start having the conversation about, okay, what are some of the solutions? How do we address some of the real and or perceived management concerns? Because I'm not convinced all of them are real. Some of them are perceived. Some are real. Name the number of interest groups that care about what happens on public lands. And if you talk to any single one of them, they'll all probably tell you that public lands are mismanaged, but they'll tell you it for very different reasons. Like, right? Like, you'll have one group that says, we don't designate enough. One says we designate too much. One says we don't log enough. One says we log too much. One says we're protecting too many species under the ESA. The other says we're not delisting enough. One of them says we have too many roads. The other one says we need to decommission roads. Like, there's, and all on the, one says we're drilling too many oil and gas wells. The other one says we need to be doing more. One says we're not grazing enough. One says we're grazing too much.
So what's the solution? And I know the solution. Yeah. You know the solution too.
Yeah.
Like, the solution is this. Like, you're right. So how do you put the pin in the grenade? You put the pin in the grenade, and if you are the person that cares and doesn't want this sell-off and disposal, and here's what you do. You have to listen to those concerns. You have to give voice to them, and you have to make an attempt to say, like, okay, we're going to listen to these things and we're going to find solutions. And like it's a collaborative process. I mean, that's what you have to do. You have to talk about these things. You have to acknowledge, you have to listen to the concern. You can't tell somebody who's concerned about this and that's their problem. Like, my problem is growing communities in Utah. Is like, oh no, you really don't have a problem. That doesn't work. What you have to do is you have to sit down with them and listen to them tell you what they think their problem is. And then you have to ask them, what are some of the solutions that you think we could do? Okay, let's listen to those. And you have to do that with everybody. And does that mean you're going to incorporate all solutions? No, it doesn't. But if you're not willing to sit and listen to the people and talk with them about their concerns and try and find a way to address them, like, these things will come back. The cancer doesn't go away without treatment. And that's what's necessary in this. And so it doesn't have to be what everybody wants is the solution, but you have to try and find the consensus. Ultimately, what has to happen is you have to put together and you have to have an effort to listen to people's voices on this. And I'm not saying listen to the voices that won. I'm saying you have to listen to the voices that lost. The people that feel like they lost, the Mike Lees of the world, the whoever was in that camp, those are the people you have to start talking to today and find out what their real concerns were and try and figure out how to address those concerns. That is the solution that you have to look for today. And yes, you have to keep your principles. You have to stay where you are. You have to stand your ground. But you can't be a poor winner. You can't be the guy that, won it right now and gets all in your face with the people that lost, and because they'll come back unless you go to them now. When you win an argument like this, if you don't want to have the argument again, you have to go to the party that lost that argument. You have to shake hands. You have to say, hey, I didn't like your solution, but let's understand the issue and let's see if we can find consensus on how to address some of those concerns. Are you going to fix all of them? No, but you don't have to fix all of them. You have to fix enough of them to strengthen your coalition.
So can I tell you the idea? The idea that I've been rattling around in my head. Am I already rolling it out?
Yeah, roll it out.
Yeah. This is an idea I've stolen because it's just reinventing something that was done before. And I thought it was a really good process that led to a really good outcome. And sometimes, then the passage of time happens and maybe you need to reassess, reevaluate, and go through a similar process. And so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, we talked about this in the last episode, how in 1964, Congress created this Public Land Law Review Commission, which was set up to review existing public land laws and regulations, and it wound up issuing this report that had all of these recommendations, dozens of recommendations to improve federal land management. And it became the core source of recommendations for passing the Federal Land Policy Management Act, that's FLPMA, and the National Forest Management Act, NIFMA. Like, it was the core for that, right? And so I look at that process and say, we're 50 years into this. We've had a sagebrush rebellion. We've had 2 or 3 additional iterations of it. We've had multiple attempts to sell and or transfer lands. We've had a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court that may come back again at the federal district court looking to dispose of federal lands. We have complaints coming from a number of states, from county commissions, from folks on the ground talking about challenges in management. You have conservation groups standing up saying, whoa, what about the landscape health and what's going on there? You have people looking at this, looking at land management right now and saying, we don't have enough enforcement on the ground. We don't have enough boots on the ground personnel to actually manage the land. We don't have enough resources going into managing the land. So there's all these different things, these different poles and tension points. And to just build on what you said, Nephi, you could construct this. You could find a bipartisan group of representatives and senators in Congress, get mirror bills running through each party that recreates this commission. And by the way, that commission, when it was established, it had 19 members back then. 6 were appointed by the president, 6 by the Senate, and 6 by the House of Representatives. And then there was another member that was elected by those 18 appointees to serve as the chairperson. So they created this structure that was meant to be a bipartisan, bicameral, involve all, both the executive and the legislative branches of government to implement this. And it was a 6-year process. They started this in 1964. The commission ended upon its report finalizing in 1970, and that finalization of the report led to the creation of these laws. Well, maybe now's the time to do something similar and have an evaluation of those same laws. Say, how have they worked? Where have there been challenges? What are the opportunities? Get all these folks in a room, and maybe some of the recommendations that come out of that are like, we might not have to overthrow we don't have to gut laws. We might be playing around the edges here, but they might identify things playing around the edges of some of these laws, making certain tweaks to them that could have profound impact on how they are implemented on the ground, how quickly they're implemented, how they're resourced, how the agencies are resourced. I don't know. I just think there could be a lot of value to saying it's been almost 50 years. No legislation is perfect. Maybe it's worth, taking it out of the politicos' hands for a minute and getting some real folks from all across the country to sit down, and, like you said, and really talk this out, but under the auspice of an endorsed, federally endorsed, congressionally endorsed commission that can give some real recommendations that might serve as the basis for some real bipartisan improvement to land management policy.
I agree. And I don't think it has to be, I think you could do it through a congressional setup. I think you could do it through the executive branch, could convene the same thing. But here's the key. This is what's important. And there are different reasons to have, it's quite frankly, it's much faster if Doug Burgum decides to do it than it is if, we get members of Congress to develop a bill to do it. Now, the challenge with that is if it's seen as being, partisan, then it's going to be less successful. So the solution is to try and find a way to make it a broad group. It's a table. Our problems are on the table. They're all on the table. And what we have to do is get everybody who's involved in that problem, and we have to give them a seat at the table to discuss it. We have to bring all of the stakeholders to the table. And we have to have a real open discussion with the folks who are, the people who have the gripe. They have to be allowed to come to the table and express the gripe. But here's what has to happen. This is why you have to have the right people at the table. It can't just be the squeaky wheel. It can't be the guy, the troll at home, trolling away on the internet. When you come to the table as a stakeholder and you say, I have a concern, you also then have to be willing to have the moderator, the person who's there, say, like, okay, tell me your solution. Tell me the solution. Let's hear the concern. Let's hear the solution. Now I want to hear the counter argument. You tell me what the counter argument is. Remembering that overhanging all of this discussion, we have a mutual agreement. What's the mutual agreement? That these are multi-use public lands that belong to all of us. Under that umbrella, let's talk about the concerns and let's talk about the solutions. We did that. You and I have been part of those processes before, where we demanded as part of the process, what was the outcome? It wasn't just a gripe session, which everybody loves to do on the internet every day. It was a real discussion of the concern that demanded at the end, you have a specific, measurable, attainable, relevant goal that was tied to the reality of time, and that people have lives and they have to be able, to make businesses work and help communities flourish and fix forests. And these things are all time relevant. That's what you have to do. You have to. And that is the way you fix this. It is by having that discussion and a process that develops real goals. Now, this is going to be making a peanut butter sandwich. And everybody needs to remember that. And we talked about it on the last episode, which is that you can't come into this process thinking that what I'm going to get is all federal lands as a hunting preserve and nobody else gets to, start their car on those lands. That's not the reality of it. But if you want to keep these lands, this is the process we have to do. And we have to find that common ground in it. In doing that, that's how you preserve them long term. That's how you put the pin in this grenade and it doesn't come back. Is it going to be perfect? No, it's not going to be perfect. But by having that discussion, 100% guaranteed, you're going to find fixes. You're going to find solutions that move us forward in a positive way. They're not going to move everything forward at the same speed in a positive way. It's not going to be perfect, but this is one of those situations where you have to have these discussions because you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
And also remember, you're still going to have your outliers. You're still going to have your ideologues on both sides of this issue, right? You're still going to have your one side of ideologues that says we should be selling these lands or we should be transferring these lands. You're still going to have ideologues on the other side that say we should lock them up and throw away the key to all uses. We should be about conserving ecosystems at the largest scale and none of these other uses should be allowed. You're going to have those ideologies that are still going to be out there. We're not saying, or at least I'm not saying, I don't think you are either, that those are going to go away. But it's like the Mike Enzi approach. Like, I think wasn't Mike Enzi's approach, Senator, late Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming, great man. His approach was something like, we're going to agree on about 90% of it, right? Like let's legislate on the 90% that we agree on. We're going to have some pieces out there that we may never agree on. But if we can get to the 90%, and in this, I'm like, if you get the overwhelming majority of people and interests to come and say, yeah, I can get behind that approach. Let's try that. And it might be for a while. You might put the pin back in that grenade for 30 years. Who knows? It may come back out again at some point. But if you get all this buy-in because everybody's bought into this process and is bought into an outcome where everybody knows they're not going to get everything they want and they're okay with that, as long as everybody's feeling like we're getting something and that our end product is better than what we started with, you're going to have that buy-in, and that you're going to keep that buy-in for decades. I believe that.
Yeah, I think you're being generous when you called it the 90% solution. I think it's the 70% solution.
You might be right.
But at the same time, you're exactly right. I mean, that's how you do it. You find that, the squeaky wheels on the far outside, and we could identify them by name if we wanted to. Like, they're not going to change. That's what they're going to be because that's where they've built their castle. But for most of us, 70% of us, we're going to be right down the middle. That's the people, and you have to have everybody at the table arguing. But ultimately, the way that you quiet the 15% on either extreme is you make them listen to the 70. And the problem that we have, I think, right now overall in politics is that the 70% just don't talk. They're quiet. They're just in the middle, and they're just kind of like, until there's a fire, they don't pull out the fire hose. And it's much easier to clean. It's much easier to just clean things up and keep it in a manageable place than it is to fight the fire when the fire breaks out. And I think that that's what this is about. Like, we have to have people who are willing to come together and say, like, okay, look, let's admit it. We do have issues with federal land management. We have communities that need to grow. We have problems. We also have solutions for those. So, are the solutions working? We've talked about them. Well, if they're not, why? Let's do an autopsy. Let's fix. It's the same thing that we've done when we talk about, like, whether it's the Endangered Species Act or anything else that's great. These things were great ideas. But let's be honest, they're not super old. They're not so old that, they don't need to be revisited every once in a while. You've got to take the car out. You've got to put new tires on it. You've got to change the oil. You know, it might be a great car and it can go for another 100,000 miles. Don't be afraid to work on it. Working on it doesn't mean that you're throwing in the towel on the car. It's the opposite. It means that you are making it so that the car can continue. And that's the challenge that we have with these land management issues is we have to be willing to talk about them without thinking that talking about them is killing them.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think we solved it already. This was fast.
Well, my check, the check's not in. Is the check in the mail? I don't know what's that is what needs to be done. So for all our listeners, I think that it's been a heck of a ride. But this episode, I think, was just kind of I think you've just kind of had to listen to our philosophy and what we think should be done. And that's just, if you're listening to us, now you know our opinions on it. And you'll hear great information from us in the future. We'll seek to be objective when as much as appropriate. But you and I both know, like, if you're listening to this podcast, it's probably because you're involved in the natural resource world and this is your mountain. And because it's our mountain and your mountain, it's something that we need to take care of. And the way to do that is to, recognize that my mountain is your mountain and we share it. And if we don't want to fight over it, I guess we have to talk about it together.
Yeah, I mean, we do like to be as objective as possible. I think we were a little bit different on this public land sale in that we both kind of acknowledged that jamming selling millions of acres of public land into a reconciliation process without any opportunity for public involvement, with language that was ill-defined and squishy and was never vetted with the public, was bad. It was bad policy, bad precedent, bad way to do business. And I don't want to speak for you. I was fully in the, I don't think we should be selling no large scale sale of public land. I just don't believe in that. Because I use it for everything. But the objectivity piece comes in with a recognition that people aren't asking for this for no reason. They've got gripes, and oftentimes there's some legitimate gripes underlying some of these efforts. Even if I disagree with the effort, I may agree with some of the underlying concerns. And that's where, your point earlier, like bringing everybody to the table and being honest about it and having a legit conversation, it can have some real value. And you still don't have to give up that core belief that you have of, I don't want to see public lands sold. I want public lands to stay in public hands. In fact, what you're doing by committing to a process like that is ensuring that they do. Right? That's kind of my view of it. So that's why I was thinking about that commission. I've been thinking about that for a while, actually, many months. But now feels like a good time to actually have some serious conversations with folks about, is it worth? Because a lot of people are saying, what do we do now? What do we do now? What's next? Do we push Representative Zinke's public lands in public hands bill? Yeah, that might be one thing worth doing. That still doesn't solve the underlying management issue. Do we adopt the Fix Our Forest Act that Representative Westerman is pushing and that Senator Daines and others are interested in? Maybe. That's still not going to solve the underlying issues. Right? Because you're still not having that all-inclusive dialogue, that brain dump, that get it all out on the table, and it'll be uncomfortable, and there could be some yelling, and you might start off. You and I are both involved in these processes. Sometimes you don't start off as friends when you go into those processes. You don't trust the person sitting across from you at the table, and it can get real tense. And then as the months go by, and you get to know them and you start to get to know their families and their interests, and you find out that, oh my gosh, we're not that dissimilar. And oh, now I'm actually hearing what you're saying instead of just reading about it in the newspaper. You can actually move the needle, and a lot can change. There's a real opportunity here at this moment in time because of what just happened to springboard and get some, like, do some real good on the back end of this. That's all.
No, it's the opportunity's here. The question is if people are going to take it. I think, I told you, like, have personal opinions about the stuff. And as I told you, I think I like to say rather that what's the right wording, Dave? I'd rather say we were right than that we won, because I think that we knew kind of where this was headed. And certainly, this discussion isn't over, and it's going to continue. It's going to continue as long as the West is growing, as long as water is, falls from the skies at and it's it's a renewable but limited resource. It's going to continue as long as people, need to make a living. And so the question is just going to be, are we going to fight about it? Every problem starts out like this. Every problem, I talked about the table. Every problem starts out where everyone's sitting around the table and you set the problem in the middle of the table and you argue over it. And it's somebody else's fault and it's somebody else's problem. The solution to fixing the problem is whether or not you have the problem on the table for long enough that you can pull people around and have them walk around the table to everybody else's seat, and they can all start to see what the problem looks like. And it becomes all of us, rather than looking at the problem from opposite sides and arguing the way that we see the problem, we've seen enough of it to be able to understand that the problem is real and to see the other person's viewpoint. And then the problem, instead of becoming your problem, it becomes our solution. And that's what we have to get to. If we don't want to face this again, next week or whenever it's going to be, it's going to require real dialogue. And real dialogue is not on Twitter screaming about somebody's political party. That's fake. If that's you, this isn't your podcast, and you're not going to be part of the solution. If you want to be part of the solution, be committed to the discussion.
I got nothing else to add. I think you summed it up. I think the only thing I'd add is if you don't like this idea that we just floated of this commission revival, give us another one. If you send us ideas you've got, we'll share them out. We'll help socialize them. Let's get people talking about real solutions. Like, that's the point of this particular episode, is like, let's get people talking about ideas, real solutions going forward on how to address some of these land management challenges we've got with all these different interests, under this, multiple use mandate that we operate under. So you don't like the idea we threw out there? Throw out more. Send us your ideas at the email yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. We would love to hear a whole host of ideas. If you're like, we shouldn't even be talking about it, there's no point in talking with folks about it, tell us that too. We just want to hear, like, this is the marketplace of ideas. Let's get the ideas flowing.
Sure. We'll give you we'll give you a log for the fire in your cave.
Send us those emails, yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. I say it all the time. I'll keep preaching it. You can also reach us on our social media platforms. The handle is @itsyourmountain on Instagram and on Facebook. We're also on YouTube a little bit. Can't remember what our handle is there, though. And we've pretty much given up on the dumpster fire, formerly known as Twitter. I don't even go look at that anymore. So, but send us your stuff. Send us your thoughts. Go out there if you haven't already. Personal favor to us, if you don't mind. Go out there to wherever you get the podcast and smash that 5-star rating for us. Leave a comment. You can call that your Patreon contribution to our podcast, that would be amazing to help help us, help our psyche, but also I assume that it also has some value in algorithms. I don't know. What I do know helps
We don't know
is if
how
you
it
tell your
works.
friends. Yeah, what I do know helps is if you tell your friends and your neighbors and your family and coworkers and all other folks out there to listen to it. The more people that download it, that's better for the algorithm, I'm sure. So do that. Help spread the word. Super appreciative. Ideas for future podcasts, let us know. We've got a really great one lining up. I'll tease it a little bit. Nephi, you know what I'm talking about. We want to talk about some Sunday hunting. So we have all these podcasts lately that have been kind of I view them as kind of bad news stories. You know, that it's going to be kind of
They're
fun
all
to do
good
one that's
news
a real
stories.
yeah, but this one's a real good news story. You know, a real good news story in real time. How Pennsylvania just passed a bill to eliminate the ban on Sunday hunting. We are going to have a conversation with some folks about that. Super excited about that in the coming weeks. So stay tuned on that. Any last thoughts from you, Nephi?
Nope.
All right, none for me either. So get out there, enjoy your public lands over this. Well, as we're recording, 4th of July holiday, as we release it, it might be later than that, but get out there, enjoy your public lands, and remember that life is about experiences. So go have one.